in at least our American context today, the church is broken. Not just the Lutheran Church, not even just the Christian Church, but across the line in all religious traditions except for non-Christian faiths, and that's because of demographic shifts. There is a marked decrease of religious affiliation in our country today. And so the first step to fixing a problem, as any good 12-step program will tell you, is to recognize and admit that there is one, and then to admit that we do not have the tools in our toolkit currently to fix the problem in a technical way. Right? So that's the first step of any 12-step program, is admitting that we have a problem and we are powerless to fix it. The other steps, move you forward from there. But until you can hit that place, it is almost impossible to do meaningful ministry in the world today. The reason for that is because our minds will always shift to the technical solutions, even to adaptive problems. So even at the same time that we might believe we academically or intellectually have an awareness that we're facing adaptive challenges, we need to innovate, experiment, try new things. Often the way we will go about trying to solve or address those challenges is through technical ways. And that's why in the question that was asked today about communications and some other conversations I've had with several of you just over time, it's so hard to really separate out and to say, no, to categorize, this is a technical fix. And quite honestly, the toolkit we have of technical fixes is not going to get us to where we need to be. And so just to illuminate that a little bit more, I'm going to try to briefly kind of set that groundwork. So the church today, this is something, hopefully it's not the first time most of you are hearing it, but I always like to not make assumptions when talking to groups of people. So where is the church today? We have a changing religious landscape in our American context, and there are local variations to this, but it is true across the country, it is true across religious traditions. Here in our area, as we're part of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic region, the shifts are more pronounced than they are in other parts of the country. Additionally, since we have an urban and suburban area here, we are demographically younger than a lot of the country, even if some of our specific local communities are not, which means these shifts are also farther along in our Philadelphia, Southeastern Pennsylvania Synod region than they are through this national data. And the third point I just want to make before getting into it is that this data is of people 18 and over, because legally that's just how they work these things. All the trends say the younger the people are, the more true these trends are. These trends among millennials, young adults, are far more produced than they are among Gen Xers, and they're far more pronounced among Gen Xers than boomers, and so on. This means the whole youngest generation we have now, which is whatever comes after millennials, which has multiple different names, the plurals, the I generation, Generation Z, aren't even factored into this data at all. Since the youngest of that generation are about 17, 18 years old now. So I just say that to say that this doesn't even really tell the whole story. The real story is farther along this course than this. So across the country, as a religious group, nuns, or people who answer none of the above when asked what their religious faith is in a survey, the fastest growing group by far is religiously unaffiliated or none of the above. From 2007 to 2014, that number jumped from 36 million to 56 million in America. So it's not quite doubling, but it's close. At the same time, across, you can see there, Catholics, mainline Protestants, evangelical Protestants, as well as falling now. 10, 15 years ago, you would be able to point and say, well, but New Covenant Church down the street is growing leaps and bounds, right? That might still be true. There are those examples. Nationally, though, that is not the trend anymore either. Those more fundamentalist, conservative, non-denominational churches are also shrinking. Just breaking it down a little bit more, this trend is true across the generations. So while it is particularly true of millennials and youth today, it is true of people of all generations. Also, as we all get older, This remaining true of millennials and young adults, it's continuing with them as they enter into what would traditionally be adulthood. So as they're becoming into their mid-30s rather than their mid-20s, these trends are still proving to be true. So nearly a quarter of Gen Xers now say that they have no particular religion or describe themselves as atheists or agnostics. That's up 4% in that last 7-year period. 2014 is the last time we have this particular set of data. Baby boomers have also become slightly but noticeably more likely to identify as religious nones in recent years. A little subpoint to that, and this is just my filter and my experience in the church, I bet a lot more of the people aren't going to church, because as boomers are retiring and traveling and doing other things, they're attending church less and less frequently or stopping altogether, but still mentally cannot make that cognitive leap to say that they're not a Christian or not a Lutheran, because that religious and cultural identity still holds a meaning for them that is not true at all among millennials, and Gen Xers, as usual, are angsty and ambivalent about, right? So with boomers, there's this tendency to still say, I'm a Lutheran, but they might not be showing up in your church, and if they are, they're probably not investing their time, money, and energy in the ways that they might have 10 or 15 years ago. About a third of older millennials, so people currently in their late 20s or early 30s, up to about 35 years old or so, now say that they have no religion. About a third of them say they have no religion, up 9% from 2007, when that same group was between 18 and 26. So what this means, and why this is important, is that 18 to 26, college age, that's when traditionally young adults are not all that active in the church anyway. In all the years we have data for, there's always kind of, everybody goes on Rumspringa. You know, you're not all that active. You're out sowing your wild oats or not so much, studying hard, whatever it might be. But then what happens? You get married, you have children, you need to get your child baptized, then there's Sunday school to go to, and there's cultural expectations around that. None of that is true anymore. So what's happening is that young adults are not coming back to church at the point in which our traditional 20th century programmatic life cycle of faith formation would have them coming back. And so we're caught almost in a death spiral. We're bleeding at the seams because those people at that critical juncture of their life, when they're going to re-engage because they're getting their children engaged in this faith formation in the church, are leaving. And again, this is true across the country, across religious denominations. So yes, thank you and good night. Let's all go home. I hope you've learned a lot that will be helpful to you in your ministry. Too often we stop there. And the one point that Seth Godin makes in the clip that I showed, the one that I shared with you is the part when something is broken and the excuse is, it's not my job, right? It's not my job to fix. Well, friends, this is our job to fix. As we shared in the devotion that we began with, it is the elders of the people, the leaders, Moses and the elders of Israel, that God calls to go out ahead of the people to lead them further along towards the promised land and help them survive another couple days by finding sustenance, water. That is our call. Our congregations are not all going to be early adopters. Right? Our congregations are not all equipped to navigate the adaptive challenges of this and immediately be on board. And that's the hard work, but that's the secondary work, navigating that change in a way that hopefully doesn't alienate or create conflict or division more than it has to. But the first part is going ahead of the people. So whether that's at your board meeting, your council meeting, whether that's at the training and conversations that you're having and being equipped for, or that your pastor is, hopefully both, it is our pastor's job and it is your job to go out ahead of the people. So we can't say, well, it's not my job that that young child might get crushed to death by a fence. That is our job to not let happen. And so the question is everyone just leaving church, right? The question is, so what? So what do we do with this? And the reason I also always begin with this is because this should not be depressing for us. This should be liberating when we hear this data. This means it's not that you are broken. It's not that you don't know how to do this. Nobody knows how to do this because the historical context in which we're in is different from any of your lifetimes, and a lot longer than that, actually. And so the way in which we need to navigate that path forward is going to require new and different thinking. I'm often reminded of, I just love the example, so I have to share it. How many of you have seen the movie Good Will Hunting? I'm so glad that most of the hands in the room went up for that one. But you know that scene at the end, that powerful scene with Robin Williams as the therapist and friend of Matt Damon, and Matt Damon is there and he's telling him, they've gotten to know each other really well, and it's not your fault. Matt has all this brokenness from his childhood and from growing up, and it's not your fault. He's like, yeah, I know, Doc, I know. It's not your fault. And he's like, I know, and he starts yelling at Robin Williams' character. And he pushes him, but Robin Williams just keeps saying, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And then Matt Damon starts crying, and then they end up hugging, and he's sobbing like profusely. That's kind of what this should be for all of us. It's not your fault. It's not your fault. Like, this is a part of God's will for the church and the world, and it's not the first time it's ever happened. So we have the privilege to live at an interesting time in the history of the church and to be a part of what the next chapter of that story looks like. That's not a dismal thing. That's not grounds for despair. There will be grief, there always is, but it is exciting work that we are called to do. And there's exciting stuff going on. Over the past 30 years, most of the traditional markers of religiosity or spirituality have remained essentially unchanged. This data is from 1987 to 2007, and you can see that the levels of people who say that prayer is an important part of their daily life, the middle one, pretty conservative in my mind, but we will all be called before God at the judgment day to answer for our sins, and I never doubt the existence of God. While they have dropped a little bit, two of the three, they've essentially stayed the same over that 30-year period of time. And that's not even the whole story. This data set is back to, I hope you can see the graphs there, back to from 2007 to 2014. So this is our context again. From 2007 to 2014, the number of people who say that they read Scripture at least once a week has stayed exactly the same. Over the same period of time, people who say that they participate in a prayer or Scripture study group at least once a week has increased by 1%. Also from 2007 to 2014, the percentage of American adults who say that they meditate at least once a week has also gone up from 39 to 40%. Granted, this is not a spiritual practice that in most of our Lutheran congregations is usually part of our Sunday worship, but it is a spiritual practice, and so it does tell us something. This is where it gets really interesting. People who say that they look to religion as their primary source of guidance on right and wrong has increased by 4% in the last 7 years. Additionally, people who say that they experience a feeling of wonder and awe at the universe, or as we might say theologically, a sense of being a created being, something being bigger than yourself, has gone up by 7% from 2007 to 2014. And similarly, people who say that they experience a feeling of spiritual peace and well-being at least once a week has also gone up by 7% from 52 to 59% in the same period of time. So this is data. And the more, just like a good scientist, the more we can remove ourselves emotionally from the data and learn from it, the better equipped we'll be to begin to navigate the adaptive challenges we face. So where do we begin? Because the world has shifted under our feet, and it's continuing to shift. By making our peace with this, we will be better equipped to be the church for the world we are actually living in, and begin to see that we are in the midst of a cultural revolution every bit as great as the Reformation itself. And we seem to be a little behind the 8 ball in the church on it, because it is happening, and God is going ahead of us. God is standing on that rock. We are just huddled together planning about or talking about all the things we missed from Egypt. So we haven't seen that he's out there. While we must be attentive to all of the many cultural forces at work, the current emerging scenario is clearly a growing population that is spiritual, growingly, increasingly spiritual, but less institutionally affiliated. Of course, we all, value deeply our religious institutions, so that is a problem. But this does give us a powerful starting point for the brave new world of the church that we are entering into. The interesting thing, some pastors and writers about the shifts we're experiencing in the Christian church frame and really break down quite well how in the 20th century, mid-late 20th century, many people in the church would describe themselves in surveys as religious, but not spiritual, right? And the reason for that is because it was the practices, it was the act of going to a church. I think David Lose invoked this in his time during our cross-generational ministry event here at the seminary last weekend. They would identify as religious in the sense of they go to church. Theodore Roosevelt? Was it? No, FDR? I don't care what church you go to as long as you go to church, right? It was culturally expected that if you were a good person, FDR, thanks, was older. I know. I couldn't remember. But it's a good example. But that was part of what you did. If you were a good person, you went to work, you paid your taxes, and you went to church on Sunday mornings. That is gone. That line of thinking for most of the American population, regardless of generation, is dead. And so that means we are in a different cultural space than we were previously. So where do we begin? We begin by asking ourselves meaningful questions, by really opening ourselves up to this reality and looking inward first. Because you always have to do that internal work before you can do the external work, right? And the external work, often we jump to those technical fixes. But until there's real change, transformational change in a person or in a community, you can't really change in how you're relating to others. Again, you think of 12-step programs, people experiencing severe addiction. It's not that they're not trying things to break the cycle, but they're not changing in a transformative way that reframes the whole way they're in relationship to everyone around them until they can make that step. That's where we're at. What does it look like to be the church for people who are increasingly spiritual but not religious? And again, these people are already in our pews as well. Increasingly, people, whether they attend church or not, are asking deeper and asking spiritual questions in different ways because the language of the culture is shifting. So it's not necessarily deeper, but it is deeper than some of the theological language and answers that we currently often impose on those questions because they're asking it in a new way. And anytime you ask a question in a new way, you're going to learn and get a deeper formative experience. What does it mean to do ministry in a world where people will simply not be joining the church to be part of an institution? In fact, that's often perceived as a negative. What does it mean to help people grow in their faith and as disciples at all ages and stages of life in a time when people are simply not looking for the right answers or for a doctrinal system? People are not going to come to church because they want to go to heaven when they die anymore. That's an adaptive challenge. That's big, because that means we need to reframe the way we theologically understand the way that the kingdom of heaven works in this world and the next one. Not that the doctrine changes, but the trappings of it, the language, what Luther would call adiaphora, shifts, just like it did in the Reformation. Luther's theology is very different than pre-Reformation theology, and yet Luther never wanted to leave the church. He wanted to reform it, right? He wanted it to come along with him. He could have used softer language at times, but he wanted it to come along with him. The way we talk about what we believe, and even the way we understand it, is shifting in our culture. And if we are going to be a relevant witness, needs to be shifting in our congregational conversations as well. And people are not looking for answers. People are looking for a place where they can honestly ask the questions emerging out of their life and lived experience. That's a big one. So how do we faithfully engage these people, and how do we help people to engage the questions, the struggle, and the experience of the Christian life without feeling like we need to have all the answers? Continue to ask the questions of how do we wrestle with the adaptive challenges we face today? What are those particular adaptive challenges, and to name them? And then also, though, begin, once we've done that hard work, to begin to look towards what possible new ways of being the church in this new world that we live in might be.